Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now in our 28th episode of 2024, but before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, our platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast. Today, we're in the nation's capital for the Fiber Broadband Association's Summer Fly-In. We had about 35 member companies at our dinner last night, and today we're divided into small groups as we meet with congressional offices on the Hill. So it's an exciting day. We'll be talking about fiber. Everybody will have the fiber adrenaline shot, so I'm really excited about that. Earlier this week, NTI approved Volume 2 BEAD proposal for Indiana. So that adds it to the 16 states now that are um, that are approved with their initial proposal. So that leaves 40 states and territories left to go. So it's just a little over 2 weeks away from our annual Fiber Connect 2024 conference in Nashville, July 28th to 31st. Registration continues to pace about 25 to 30% ahead of last year's record attendance. So if you haven't registered, I wouldn't wait. Please do so ASAP. And then after Fiber Connect, we will be in Des Moines in September, Calgary in October, and Albuquerque in November. So hopefully you guys can join us at some of those. That brings us to today's Five for Breakfast session. Our guest today is Tyler Cooper, the editor-in-chief of BroadbandNow, who's going to be discussing the digital divide, municipal broadband's shifting role. Before I formally introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce David Norris from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you everybody who's joined us today. Before I go over a few logistics, we'd like to once again thank our platinum sponsor, Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, if you would all please keep in mind, all participants are in listen-only mode today. To ask a question, please type it into the question box, which is located in the control panel on the upper right side of your screen. We will host Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's session. This presentation is also being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours. That recording is under the Events tab, under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. Finally, at the conclusion, we will have a survey, very brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to complete that survey. We really appreciate the input. And with that, I will pass things back over to Gary. Thanks.
Thanks, David, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest was Jimmy Todd, the CEO and General Manager of Kansas-based network operator Nextech, and our 2024 Chairman of Fiber Broadband Association. He joined me in the fireside chat to discuss rural broadband, precision agriculture, and his role as the chair of FBA. So hopefully you guys will seek Jimmy out at the conference, have a chat with him. He's a great guy and a wealth of information, especially on rural broadband. Today on Fire for Breakfast, our guest is Tyler Cooper. The editor-in-chief of BroadbandNow is going to be discussing the digital divide, municipal broadband's shifting role. Tyler's editor-in-chief of BroadbandNow. BroadbandNow and its analytic arm, BroadbandNow Research, covers social, economic, and political issues related to broadband technology, such as digital inclusion, municipal broadband, telecom legislation, emerging technologies, and the impact of broadband on everyday life. Tyler's an active speaker in the industry at conferences and events such as the National Digital Inclusion Alliance Net Inclusion Conference, NPR's In Conversation, and Broadband Breakfast Live online. And of course, he's been a guest before on the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. Tyler has more than a decade experience in the telecom industry, and he's been writing about broadband issues like digital divide, net neutrality, cybersecurity, and internet access since 2015. Tyler's work is internationally recognized. He's been published on sites like VentureBeat, TechRadar, Digital Trends, The Next Web. He's been featured in Vice, Fox News, The Voice of America, and many other outlets. So with all that, welcome, Tyler. And for our audience, please type in your questions as we go, and we'll work those into discussion. So with that, let's get things started. I'll turn it over to Tyler.
Well, thanks, Gary. Really appreciate it. Happy to be here again. I'm all the way down here in Texas. For anyone who doesn't know, again, thank you. I'm Tyler Cooper, editor-in-chief at BroadbandNow. Today I want to kind of talk through municipal broadband, how I feel that its role is changing and shifting as we kind of enter the BEAD era in earnest. I think so. The best way is probably just to jump in. For the past decade, I've been writing and thinking about inventive ways to bring my favorite innovation, the internet, to everyone in the United States. One of the more sort of over time endearing and enticing possibilities that I've consistently come across is the idea of community internet providers or municipally owned broadband. Now, I think so. We've tried many things to bring the internet to everyone over the past decade. We've spent over $90 billion since 2009 trying to close the digital divide, and it is still here. And now we're preparing to spend over $44 billion new dollars to build broadband, mainly rural broadband networks in areas that are unserved. And that's obviously a significant investment, a massive opportunity. One of the main challenges I think we've faced historically in these areas is that we're building where it's hard to sort of justify a business plan. The sort of revenue generated from rural communities might not be sufficient to sort of fund ongoing operations and future upgrades in some cases. And in many smaller cities and towns across the US, over 400 of them by some counts, municipal providers have been a lifeline to residents in these areas, offering fast speeds and prices that tend to be more competitive than whatever entrenched providers are offering in their area. Despite that, there's a problem, and there's been a problem, and that's building out and running these networks has long been a difficult task in many states across the country, and that's due to a litany of restrictions and roadblocks that are put in place to hinder these networks. Now, in 2024, there are still 16 states that have major restrictions on establishing and running these networks. And you can view the full list on our website. The report should be linked here in the webinar. I've been writing up some version of this report each year for about 8 years now, I think, 8 years. And back then, the number was around 25 states. So, things have definitely improved over time. And even in just the last, 5 years or so since COVID, things have also, changed dramatically for municipal broadband. Speaking of that specifically, I think, the title of this is the shifting role of municipal broadband. And I think part of that kind of goes, if we can go back in time for a second to 2020 and the sort of Biden campaign promises. So during his 2020 presidential campaign, Joe Biden made bold promises to bridge the digital divide. And part of that was prioritizing a local approach to closing the divide. So prioritizing next generation technologies and, organizations like municipal and local broadband. They promised to promote local solutions, explicitly stating that the community broadband networks would be prioritized to sort of ensure that local communities had all the tools at their disposal to build their own networks. As part of that, there was going to be a commitment to provide federal funding and support specifically for these networks, recognizing their potential in some of the areas that they'd already been long established. And one of the other major things that they promised was to remove these state-level barriers that restrict the development of municipal broadband, sort of a national preemption on laws that restricted or hampered them. So, we can fast forward back to today, and what have we got? We've essentially received none of those things. The sort of initial focus on municipal broadband has been replaced by sort of vague commitments to expand internet access through various means, including, very good things like public-private partnerships. There's been a lot of good work, and municipal networks have continued regardless. But we also have this sort of, the BEAD grants have emerged as this the major sort of mechanism through which the Biden administration hopes to deploy broadband and close the digital divide. And it is, a significant effort, I think. But, despite how promising the BEAD grants remain, they've become a much less promising vehicle for deploying municipal broadband nationwide, to hear a lot of the carriers themselves say this. And there's also been no direct action to remove these state-level barriers. There's been some back and forth with BEAD, with the NTIA, with some of the language. So, I think despite the roadblocks and the restrictions, municipalities will still have the opportunity to compete for funding through BEAD. That said, whether they will successfully secure any funding or even choose to apply in many areas remains uncertain. I think, many of these networks, especially if you kind of look at the existing landscape of municipal providers, many of them are so ahead of the game that programs like BEAD aren't even particularly relevant to them, I think. Stalwarts like EPB in Chattanooga would be an example of one of those. Utopia Fiber in Utah would probably be another. In these cases, these networks are well established to their footprints, and they're, really the work they have to do is really expanding and sort of upgrading technology and building along what they've already done and continuing that momentum. In other cases across the country, I've spoken to some municipal providers that tend to be operating in suburban areas that would really already be considered served by BEAD standards, right? Especially this first era of BEAD, where we're looking specifically at unserved, broadband deserts, really. So that's BEAD. I think for a bit of historical context with how municipal networks have fit into the equation, the FCC has long recognized that there's a problem in rural broadband, right? And that we need subsidies in these areas to support rural broadband efforts, and they've implemented numerous programs to address this. For decades, really, the FCC has sort of created distinct subsidies for small telephone companies and cooperatives versus large companies. So, small rural telcos received higher levels of subsidy in many cases because they struggled to sort of stay afloat without that support. Meanwhile, large telcos with urban and suburban operations across the country were expected to sort of subsidize their rural expansion with profits from more populated regions. And in some cases, we've kind of seen how that's gone. Now, that's subsidies. The BEAD grants, that's not a subsidy program, right? Instead, these are grant programs. This is a grant that is designed to build broadband infrastructure. So the vast majority of dollars spent through BEAD are going to be used for constructing new networks, ideally fiber networks. And there's some minor reimbursements for compliance and digital inclusion and things like that. What there isn't is money to cover ongoing operating expenses for the rural networks that are going to be built. These networks, this money is to get these connections in the ground on poles, create broadband where there isn't broadband, right? Which is great. But I think what this sort of is going to create is post-BEAD, we'll really see a mix of rural broadband networks with varying levels of federal support. Some areas are going to receive ongoing subsidies as they do, while others built with BEAD or similar grants will not. And this creates a potential mess in a lot of ways, with adjoining areas receiving drastically different levels of federal support, even when their local cost characteristics are identical. I think in that sense, it's inevitable, sort of looking out over the timeline of BEAD, that the companies winning BEAD grants will start lobbying and requesting operating subsidies within a few years. The FCC is going to sort of face a challenge, I think, creating a sustainable subsidy program for all of rural broadband once we have the sort of base level networks in place to sort of support all of the people that don't currently have internet. They could sort of continue existing programs. I think a more comprehensive approach would be to sort of redesign the subsidy program for the post-BEAD world, potentially using maybe something like a cost-based system, going back, harkening to the original Universal Service Fund, the USF. But sort of, all of this is kind of contextualized against the fact that we're now entering this new, slowly entering this new phase of BEAD, right? We're starting to sort of see the early stages of implementation and planning to actually roll these funds out. And amidst all of that chaos, there's something lost in the conversation, I think, which is that once the dust sort of settles, what will the competitive environment look like in these areas? We're building out broadband in areas that don't have any broadband today, but 10 years from now, we want to make sure that those areas have a vibrant competitive marketplace. And it's here that I think municipal providers stand to make the most impact over time, as they have historically. And it is for that reason that I encourage them, anyone, if you are a municipal provider or wanting to be, I encourage you to be a part of BEAD where it makes sense, even though it seems like there's some frustration, and some of the ones I've spoken to have seemed like they might not have the time or resources to go after these BEAD grants, or they feel they won't receive them. But I think municipal providers have long played this role in communities they serve. They spur competition and innovation. They build future-proof technologies, primarily fiber, and they're more in tune in general with the needs of their communities than other providers. So when we arrive in that post-BEAD era, and we've finally closed the infrastructure gap in one way or the other, my hope is that municipal providers will sort of flourish, offering crucial support for communities and being offered support that they require to promote a healthy landscape from state bodies and the federal government alike. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the main overview of where we are. We have over 400 networks operating today. I'd love to take any questions about what where we're at, or really just kind of talk municipal broadband.
All right, so Tyler, you had said that previously it had been like 25 states that had state laws kind of prohibiting or making it difficult for broadband municipal networks. Now that number's dwindled to like 16. Is that right?
That's right.
And so some of the ones that have recently eliminated those state laws, or like Minnesota might be an example, but New York and others. So how are they able to get that through, and kind of do you see that continuing on?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think it's been a battle of attrition, I think, across the country for years now. The sort of municipal broadband as a topic is not immune to sort of political tides, as it were. So I think that often it's a matter of the right sort of people lining up at the right time to sort of make something happen. In the case of Minnesota, they had a state law that had been around for a long time that sort of required municipalities to sort of obtain a referendum, a supermajority, which is a pretty common tactic used to sort of discourage municipal providers. And in that particular situation, it was just a few months ago, the restrictions were completely removed in an omnibus commerce policy bill, which you can see in the article. But that was sort of a move by this Democratic governor, Tim Walz. And so I think in many cases, what we see is that, again, there's sort of a political will to sort of make this happen, and also just an aligning of the stars. And in many cases, that starts with a sort of grassroots advocacy campaign from local communities that are sort of pointing to successes and showing how they can sort of duplicate that, or even just showing the work they've already been doing despite restrictions in many cases.
So assuming that we don't have administration change, right, and saying that the Democrats continue on for another term, we see stuff like the Chevron deference disappear. And so does that, I mean, let's take Tennessee, for example. She identified Tennessee's one area that has some not so great laws against community broadband, yet EPB is one of the best in the world, and they have 70% market share. But I guess in Tennessee, you're limited. You have to be electric co-op, and you can only serve broadband in areas where you serve electricity. And so EPB's efforts to have that success go beyond their power serving area has been thwarted by, well, they went to the FCC, they were able to get some relief, but then that got kind of, beat down. So what is happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, you said it. I think EPB is a real aberration. They've been doing amazing work for well over a decade now, providing, like you said, some of the best service in the world. And yeah, I think Tennessee is an interesting case. They do allow municipalities to offer utilities, including broadband, but it has to be along their existing footprint. And that there's definitely been challenges. Chattanooga, and there's also been, I think, other officials who sort of challenge the state laws directly in a way that we haven't really seen a lot of. And that it initially, as you said, sort of had some momentum, and it sort of sought to preempt the state laws entirely, but the ruling was overturned. It really they've kind of been back and forth to hear them say it, about this. So I think it feels to me as though, obviously, the past 4 years, I think a lot of times when we hear these major discussions at the national level about infrastructure planning and deployment and the infrastructure bill and sort of building all of these things, broadband, it's certainly been recognized as something more important than ever, I think, over the past 4 years with the pandemic, and everyone sort of shifting to this new modality of thinking about broadband. But it still kind of gets swept under the rug, among communities like this one. We are all about this and we sing its praises. But I think that in general, sometimes broadband kind of gets swept under the rug and sort of, couched amidst much larger, more pressing sort of political sort of goals and aspirations among administrations. So it's difficult to say what happens if we don't have an administration change and there's sort of 4 more years of the status quo. I really don't know. I'd really like to see a sort of return to some of those promises, some of those campaign promises, and maybe relook at how we can support these networks going forward, especially as we start to hit the ground running with BEAD and other initiatives.
So one of the questions from the audience is, while they think municipal ISPs are great in their traditional footprint, going after BEAD funding is challenging from a number of aspects. One is just the rules, the match, letter of credit. There seems to, while the administration had said this is going to be kind of tilted towards municipal networks, the rules are kind of tilted away from municipal networks. Also, the fear that ISPs will, the larger ISPs will go after the funding to just prevent municipals from taking this money. So the question was, what is the strategy? How do municipalities get around all this, especially on the match?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I think, like much of BEAD, this is a state administered program. So I think the answer to that might be as political as it is strategic, right? I think in many states, we'll see, we might see BEAD or sort of municipal and local solutions take a more center stage. States that have sort of proven out a track record of wanting to work for local solutions and prioritize those and prioritize fiber. And really work with stakeholders and communities that are really engaged with the community and understand the unique needs that they have. But I think we'll see other states that sort of, may have a different sort of dominant political ideology that, $0 might go to municipal providers and co-ops in those states. So I think, it really comes down to understanding the sort of environment that the state sort of exists within, understanding the sort of sentiment of the state broadband offices, which are going to ultimately be deciding this. And, many of them have kind of signaled their intention with their initial proposals, kind of showcasing, where they are with BEAD, in some cases kind of, calling it out and saying this is something that we do want to work with and we want to hear from those communities. And in other cases, I think, again, sort of, larger providers will be able to sort of, rule the day.
So, BEAD has been taking much longer to roll out than anybody could have possibly imagined, and doesn't seem to be going any faster. So one of the questions says, okay, what happens if there's an administration change?
Yeah, administration change. Well, I think the answer is that I don't know. I think the BEAD program is happening at a glacial pace, but it is happening. I don't see that stopping or anything drastic like that. But I do think that again, the tactics and methods used by states to sort of deploy broadband on their own terms. We've seen a lot of whisper about this, about even the sort of regulating by by grant, as it's sort of, I've seen it said. A lot of these state broadband offices kind of including social policies in their sort of decision making when it comes to doling out these funds. I think, in many cases that's kind of been allowed. It seems up till now. That might change. There might, if there was an administration change, there might be a more heavy-handed approach from the federal government in dealing with the sort of administration of the funds. But I think it's really difficult to say. I mean, again, we're 4 months out from the election, and obviously we've all heard a lot about the issues and the candidates and other ways, but we haven't really heard a lot about broadband in terms of being expounded upon by either side. So I think without a clear indication or weather vane, it's difficult to say what will happen to BEAD or really any program. The continuation of the ACP, the ongoing initiatives for digital inclusion, all of these things. I think we need more information on.
Now, yesterday in the New York Times, they had like some mayors, and it says, what is something the rest of the country could learn from your city? So Mesa, Arizona, Mayor John Giles, who's a Republican, said, we adopted a city goal of trying to get fiber optic cable to every home and every business in our city, and that required innovation. And so I looked at Mesa to see, did they launch a Muni network? And what they did is they launched an RFP, RFI, and they basically asked the private sector to come in and say who can serve every home and business in Mesa. And so they have Comcast, AT&T, Gigapower, Google Fiber. So they have a plethora of service providers that come in to do kind of public-private partnerships. So one could argue, why would a community launch a municipal network if they could be able to do like Mesa and be able to raise their hand and say, come on into our city and we'll make it easy for you. And I mean, what's the argument there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I welcome that. I think that's great. Frankly, I think we should have a wealth of private providers operating in every city, but for some reason we don't have that. We don't have providers like the ones you just named in every city and town, especially ones where municipal providers have sort of stepped up to the plate and started offering incredible service. Um, in my ideal scenario, I think Mesa should have a municipal provider anyway, and there should just be another competitor, another option that is providing broadband in that area. If they don't need that, then that's a decision the city can make. But I don't know. I think when I think about this sort of thing, I think municipal broadband. This is really basic, but building municipal broadband is building a public road in your city instead of a private driveway and sort of paying for it. I think the roads connect everyone and are maintained by public funds. Municipal broadband acts in much the same way and provides universal access that's sort of immune to changing appetites from the private sector, which we have seen. They're doing incredible work all across the country. I think that's great. But it's also just a long-term investment in the community's infrastructure, no different than any other city-funded utility in my mind.
So there's a number of questions that kind of go to the ACP question. It's if a municipality from whatever way can get broadband to their community, not everybody can afford it. And so not only being just to be able to afford the monthly service, but the devices and things like that. So what is the community's responsibility to make sure that everybody can, since ACP is no longer?
Yeah, what's their responsibility? Well, I think municipal providers have long been ahead of the curve to listen to consumer polls and just information. I've spoken to consumers across the country about municipal networks when they have the access to them, and it looks from our own pricing data that we've collected, those services tend to be lower price on average in many cases. So I think they're already ahead of the game in many instances, but there's a lot of strategies, I think, in the sort of post-ACP environment that municipal providers can work towards. I've heard of providers creating sort of hyper-localized subsidy programs funded by city budgets or local partnerships. Part of that could be exploring things like sliding scale pricing based on income or sort of doing the private industry standard, right, of offering basic plans with reduced speeds at lower costs. I think that can also help. Oh, I lost your audio there.
Hi, Gary. It looks like we lost your audio.
Oh, he might have lost our audio.
It looks that way. Well, I think we are just about to wrap things up here. Hi, Gary. I don't know if you can hear us, but we're not able to hear you.
Okay, now I can hear you.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I
Solved.
must have lost my internet. Anyway, so next week will be Brian Dar of Ookla. Always love having Ookla. They have tons of great data. So please join us next week, Wednesday. And thanks again, Tyler. We'll see you guys next time.
Great. No, thank you very much.